Okay, so good afternoon, welcome. We're going to start the redundancy program now. So this is going to be a short workshop. It's going to last no longer than 2 hours, so 3 o'clock. If we finish beforehand, fine. Just a little bit about tech then. Keep your videos off if you want to, and also if you can keep on mute, just for while we're going through the initial kind of stages of the workshop. There will be opportunities for you to ask questions, and we will be asking you to ask those questions, because that, of course, is what this workshop is all about, is giving you an opportunity to kind of understand some of the key themes that we're going to be working through, but also to have your opportunity to ask questions. So what we're going to suggest is, and I'm going to ask Paul to introduce himself in a second, because Paul and I are going to be co-hosting this. We're going to suggest that as I go through, and I'm using a PowerPoint as a backdrop, and I'm simply using it as a backdrop to give us some key themes that we can pick up as we're going along. So it just gives us a bit of logic, really, to the whole discussion. If something comes up as we're going through the PowerPoint, you want to ask a question, just unmute yourselves and say, can I ask a question? It's fine. There are not too many of us today that you can do that. I'm also going to be, if I make any key points, I'll stop sharing my screen and I'm going to use the chat to make any key points, and then I can save the chat. So if we put any links up there or anything like that, I'll put that on there as well. So if people want to introduce themselves by using chat, you've got a button at the bottom of the screen. If you just click on chat, and I'm sure you're all aware of it and are very used to using it. Please just type a little message in there, just say who you are and from where you are at the BBC. That would be really useful so that people can see who's here and who they might want to speak to afterwards, because obviously it's a good opportunity to see whether there's anybody here that you might want to talk to afterwards as well as a follow-up. I don't think there's anything else apart from let's get going. Paul, would you like to introduce yourself before we start?
Yeah, hi. Most of you hopefully know who I am. It's Paul Seagate, National Broadcasting Organiser. I've been at the NUJ for about the last 11 months. Before that, I was the NUJ's BBC secondee, or one of them, for about 10 years. And on and off, I've worked for the BBC for about 20 years. So I know how it works, or how it doesn't work in some cases.
Thanks, Paul. That's great. So Paul and I will be co-hosting this, as I've said. So I'm just going to share my screen now, and I'm going to start talking to you about redundancy. Now, obviously, the situation that you find yourselves in is that this is not theoretical. This is actually happening. So we've changed the workshop today to hopefully pick up on some of the key things that you need to be thinking about. So we're going to be looking at understanding the impact of COVID-19 on the redundancy legislation, because it is important to understand the context in which you're talking about redundancy today, in that there is a very different context, because we are in a very different situation. So it's really important to understand whether there have been any changes and what we need to be thinking about in terms of redundancy in the present situation. Understanding what an employer's responsibility is when making employees redundant. Obviously, we're going to be looking at what an employer should do, but not just looking at the law. We're also going to be looking at what is good practice. And particularly, we're going to be looking at what areas perhaps we could negotiate on, or we could challenge on, we could resist on, those kinds of things. That's what we're going to be looking at today. And of course, this is an opportunity for you to share good practice when negotiating around redundancy as well. So I know some of you here have already negotiated around redundancy in the past. So you might have things that you might want to share with other people about what you tried, what you did, what worked well, all those kinds of things. So we'll be encouraging you to do that. So let's start off then by just giving a bit of context to this, really. This is from a government website. Employers must play their part in our time of national crisis by protecting jobs as far as possible. So we understand, obviously, with furlough schemes, all these kinds of things have been really useful. Obviously not relevant in your particular situation and in the situation that you find yourselves in now. But nonetheless, it's important to understand that there is a particular responsibility that employers have at the moment, and we're going to be looking at some of the issues around that. So let's talk about what we mean by redundancy. Some of you will be well aware of what we mean by redundancy, and most of the information that I've got here is based on 2 sources, and I'm going to be looking at those sources at the end and just introducing you to where you can go to find out about a lot of the information that we're going to be talking about here, but also any follow-up information that you might want. One is ACAS, the Arbitration, Conciliation and Advisory Service, and also the Labour Research Department. And I'm going to be introducing you to two key things there, which will be really useful for you. And this is where most of the information has come from. So in the particular situation that you find yourselves in, redundancy is about the requirements of the business for employees to carry out work of a particular kind. So basically, the BBC has decided that actually they need fewer people doing the work that needs to be done. And therefore that is a definition of redundancy. Did somebody want to say something? No, maybe that was just interference. Okay.
Well, I thought someone was going to say something. It's Martine here. My understanding is there needs to be, you're probably going to come on to this and I'm jumping the gun, but there needs to be a reduction in workload. The same amount of work can't be left for fewer people to do. Isn't that right?
That's not what the law says, unfortunately. They don't have to
argue that, though.
You could, oh, absolutely right. Yeah, you can, and you should be arguing that, because obviously when it comes to health and safety and welfare, we should be looking at the issues of, well, what's going to happen with all the work that's left, and what's the health and safety, the duty of care that an employer has towards the people that are left to do that work. So no, absolutely, Martine. And risk assessments are part of what we're going to be talking about. What kind of risk assessments are being done on how the work is going to be done safely and in a healthy way when those people go. But the law doesn't actually say that.
I think that's a good point. I think that is a good point, because there's been so many job cuts at the BBC over the last 10 years, so much so-called salami slicing, that I think in the early days, 10 years ago, we did cut some of the slack, and we could still produce good programs without being incredibly stressed. But the slack has gone now, and any cuts that are made going forward, it means that we simply can't carry on doing what we have been doing. So standards are going to drop, and it also means that people are going to be under incredible stress to do a job and a half rather than just their own job. So I think that you make a really good point, Martine, which is why the BBC always says there'll be no more salami slicing. But then it goes ahead and does salami slice. Although part of the reason for that is, I think, is the unions, because whenever the BBC announces that they are axing something, like a few years ago it was Six Music and the Age Network, we rally around and we save the programme, which then leaves the BBC with no options but to salami slice. So I think that's part of the problems, that's part of the conundrum that we're facing.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Martine. It's really important to understand and look at the ways, as Martine has pointed out, ways of which we can challenge an employer and look at their other duties. So what other duties of care might they have towards their workforce when they're making these kind of announcements and making these kind of, sorry, I'm just bringing other people in, apologies. So it is important to kind of look outside this. So examples of redundancy can be closure of the whole or part of a business, or relocation to another site, introduction of new technology. And this, I think, is an area that we need to be, or you need to be thinking about, really, is, if we're saying that actually we need how we're going to maintain the quality, how we're going to maintain the output if you've got fewer people doing the work, because most of the people that are being targeted, or most of the jobs that are being targeted, are the people that are actually doing the day-to-day work in the BBC. It's a particular level, isn't it, of people who are being targeted in terms of the work that's being done. So this could be an area, and this could be an area that they could actually use as an argument in terms of introducing new technology. So we're going to introduce new technology, new platforms, new kinds of things which are going to make it easier for people to do more work. I mean, I think this is a really kind of very problematic area, because obviously new technology doesn't necessarily mean that you can do more work in a healthy and safe way. Actually, it could be the opposite. Loss of a contract leading to less work, or merger of two businesses, obviously, can also be other examples. Trade union involvement will increase the likelihood of quick and widespread agreement on the best way forward for large numbers of employees. And so our involvement in this whole process is really important in terms of pushing back and challenging. And particularly in terms of making sure that and I'm going to come back to these 2 points here, that the way the process takes place is fair and non-discriminatory. And we're going to talk about what we mean by fair and non-discriminatory. And I want to hear from any of you that have had any experiences of where you believe something has been done in an unfair way or in a discriminatory way. So, those things I'm going to come back to. The other important thing here, of course, is about redundancy during COVID-19. a really important part of our role as reps is to make sure members are aware of the process and aware of what their rights are during the process. So this is something that we can very proactively do, is actually make members aware of what their rights are, particularly in terms of individual consultation, what should take place in terms of individual consultation, how it should take place, who should be involved, how long it should last for, all these kinds of things that we're going to come back to. And of course, we're going to obviously we're going to be talking about the BBC policy here as well. So if any of you, and I'm sure most of you have got the BBC redundancy policy and you've been through it, because there are some areas that I think we can look at that could help us to kind of challenge on certain things. The usual rules around redundancy have not changed. So in terms of the law, nothing has changed at all. And I think this is really important to acknowledge, because there is a feeling, and I remember this working on redundancy in the past, various different times, 2008 I remember very well, where employers used the recession, as it was at the time, as an opportunity to get rid of certain types of people. And you know, I worked doing partnership training with employers and workforces, and employers were very open about, oh yeah, we're going to use it as an opportunity to target certain people. And I think we need to be very aware of that this isn't being used as a kind of a smoke screen, that we're going to go and pick on certain people or certain areas that we want to get rid of. So obviously there are going to be logistical issues around the situation that we find ourselves in. In particular, many staff might be working from home, and I know the percentage of the number of people that are working back at BBC in London, for example, I think it's only about 8% occupancy at the moment. I don't know what they're thinking about in terms of taking that forward, but that means that most of you are working at home. So how the consultation period, how the consultation process takes place is obviously going to be quite different, because it's probably not going to be face-to-face. So of course, logistical issues mean that things are going to take longer. And I think this is really important to acknowledge as well, that even though we talk about a 30-day in consultations, the consultation period, depending on how many people are being going from a particular area or a workplace, actually we should be looking to make it as long as possible. So organisations, this is actually from the Chartered Institute for Personnel and Development, and I think it was really useful to look at this, because this is the information that they're giving employers. So they're saying to organisations, think about carefully about the redundancy pooling and selection criteria. So they're talking about that fairness, because we are already seeing employers kind of just picking on people. Maybe people who are, for example, if you've got people who are disabled, you've got workers who are disabled, or indeed you've got women who are off on maternity or are pregnant, particularly vulnerable, because an employer will often overlook their responsibilities towards those groups of workers, and it's important that we know that there are responsibilities that an employer has. Staff are probably entitled to their full salary. They are entitled to their full salary, and again, I've put that on there because some organisations are trying to wheedle out of paying the correct amount of redundancy payment. So if people are on furlough, for example, or who are working on new terms and conditions that haven't been properly and fairly negotiated and agreed, that some employees are finding that employers are saying, well, we're only going to pay you on what you're being paid through furlough at the moment, or you've gone from full-time to part-time, we're only going to pay you on the part-time, and we're going to ignore all the full-time that you've been doing in the past. So it's important to kind of understand those. Redundancies, dismissals may be unfair dismissals if they don't take place properly. So if there are certain things an employer doesn't do, which is what we're going to talk through next. So just want to ask you for a second before we carry on about some of the challenges that you envisage. I'm going to stop sharing now, and I want to just ask you to just unmute yourself, and just because we want to know what some of your challenges are, so that we can start supporting you in addressing them. So is that Pia, would you like to go first and just share a challenge you've got, and I'll put it into chat?
Sure. So they want to shut down my department again and move the staff to online and news gathering, and get rid of our, I don't say this lightly, our really brilliant, supportive and decent manager. So this has been done before, and the consequence was huge mental health issues for everyone. They whittled away. First they got rid of the editor, then the assistant editors one by one, and the staff had to do all the work were extremely vulnerable, had none of the right equipment. They had nobody to talk to about anything. They had no support. And we were all crying on a daily basis at work.
Right. Okay.
So
I
I predict that happening again.
mean, this is really serious stuff, Pia. I mean, this is a health and safety issue, and we know that they've got certain responsibilities, particularly around mental health. So, yeah, thank you. We'll come back to some of those points. Thank you, Pia. Would anybody else like to share anything that they've got concerns about?
Maria here from Newsnight. So
Thank you, Maria.
Hi there. We started our redundancy process, savings as it's called, way back in January, and it was paused. And then we were told, but there's been no official notification to those who are in category 1 that the process has started, so that they've got a sort of timeline. So at the minute, we're sort of dealing with rumours and sort of catch up, and we're kind of not sure, and it's very unsettling for those who are in category 1 and, you know, for the team in general. Plus also, there is an issue. Newsnight has been functioning throughout the COVID crisis, and, you know, the team is really tired, and I'm not quite sure, you know, they are supportive to some extent, but I'm not sure if they're really taking that on board in terms of people being able to cope both with working, you know, long shifts, as well as sort of with the backdrop of COVID and with the backdrop of redundancies. And I don't think that's really been fully understood.
Yeah, I mean, this is all. Thank you very much, Maria. These are all health and safety issues, and that should be addressed. So yeah, we'll come back to that point. Thank you. Anybody else like to add anything?
Yes, can I jump in, Caroline? It's
yeah, and then Kate, I'll come to you afterwards.
So just, this is quite complicated, but essentially they're planning to abolish all Radio 4 sequence reporter jobs and put us in a big pool with all the news gathering correspondents in the newsroom. And what they've come up with is a proposal to cut what they say will ultimately be around 30 jobs and to replace them with 14 new jobs. And the new job description is essentially the news gathering correspondence job with a couple of bits added on. So Radio 4 sequence reporters are extremely unhappy about this because it's a very different kind of job from the job that we do. It has no opportunity to do agenda setting, original journalism. And at the moment, they say this cannot be delayed. Our proposal, which Paul knows about, is that we get this delayed. Our post can be closed along with what we understood to be a big modernisation, which would potentially open up other jobs for us. So that's what we're asking for, because currently what we see is a job description that really isn't written for us. It's written for other people. So we consider there might be an element of unfair dismissal there because other people are so much better qualified for it. And also it doesn't value the things that we bring to the BBC, which the BBC itself says are its core values.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much, Sancha. Yeah, there's a lot there, particularly around whether you're being offered something which is equivalent to what you're actually doing at the moment and whether that's fair. And again, there's some subjective things there. Sorry, I've misspelt values. And that, you know, subjective things are always problematic because people have different views about what values mean, what your value is, and so on and so forth. We'll come back to some of those points. Thank you.
But I think we can categorize some of, sorry, I'll let you go, but I'll come back to that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Sancha. We will come back to it because we want to talk about how we can actually challenge some of this, and then you can come in, please, and do share. Kate, I think you're next, and then Hannah.
Okay, thank you. So in the radio newsroom, we were already told of 13 job cuts, so we're all at risk on SJ and BJ levels. In January, so we get on the domestic side of things where I am, we're negotiating currently on 6 job losses, and then they just threw into the mix in the latest announcement that they were going to rethink how summaries were done and where they were done. Now, we only bear in mind that we came in to London throughout the COVID-19 and still are. And when many were at home and put ourselves at risk, basically, to then be told that actually the whole operation might, or the summaries operation at least, might be moved to Salford, feels like a kick in the teeth.
Right. Okay.
And to have nothing solid to work with,
Okay. Yeah. Right. Thanks very much, Kate. Yeah. I mean, again, some really big concerns there about jobs being moved, and without any consultation, by the sounds of it, without any discussion. So again, we'll come back to that. Hannah, would you like to share something that you've got?
Sure, I'll try and solve our situation as quickly as possible, because it's complicated. But again, it's very much kind of cart before horse, because they basically told us a number and haven't told us kind of how they plan for us to continue doing, like, output the amount that they want us to output based on the number they've given us. So I'm from the Live Political, so I represent Millbank. The cuts are almost exclusively to the Live Political Programmes Department and to BBC Parliament. So over Live Political Programmes and BBC Parliament, I think it's 11.7 overall. Laura might correct me, she's also here from BBC Parliament, but she's also here from Millbank. But if we just look at Live Political Programmes specifically, so we've got within that show, within that department, 22 staff overall, if everyone's in scope, with 9 proposed post closures. So that's of 7 BJs, 3 will be at risk. Of 9 SJs, 1 at risk. And of our assistant editors, who the union doesn't represent, 2 out of 4 are at risk. So a couple of things with this. So at the moment, Politics Live has got a film unit that's going, which we, as the union, are sort of, that's not really a battle that we want to have, in a sense that we don't think there's any way of reversing that decision. But what we are trying to secure for those members is some idea of when the politics hub, story hub, will be created, what that will look like, and how they can get jobs in that, because obviously their skills are very relevant to that. But what we're worried about is that the clock starts ticking from them now, before the hubs are created, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So a large part of our negotiation is going to be trying to move them onto that, but because we haven't got a rounded plan, we don't know, it's particularly difficult for them, because they don't know if they should be applying for that, or what they should be applying for, or if they go off and get other jobs, will they miss out on it? But if we keep you see the problem, so we don't know. And then the rest of it, we kind of thought that Politics Live would be getting cancelled or brought down to just 1 show a week. We're going to be producing 4 episodes of Politics Live a week, 1 episode of the Andrew Marr Show, which is quite a lot of work, because that's what I produce, but has relatively few members of staff. The Westminster Hour, specials like debates, election specials, and also potentially a new Andrew Neil interview show. And Andrew Neil is not going to accept, with the greatest respect to every other producer in this organisation, we have specialist people who work with him, and he's not going to accept just sort of taxi rank, like whoever's there. He needs people that he's worked with before and trusted. So we presume that that's going to go to our department, but we don't know about it. So yeah, we use a lot of staff, but we don't know what our department's going to look like. We don't know what work those staff are going to be asked to do. I don't know, I'm not describing it very well, but it's like a lot of going, but we don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're saying, I mean, clearly it's hugely complicated. I can hear that, and there are lots of unknowns there, and I think that makes it really problematic in terms of how do your members respond to it, because if they don't know what they're responding to, because there are no clear plans, then it makes it really stressful. But you're also expected to continue with a high output. I mean, that's coming across clear.
Yeah, and there are also BJs who want to report, and who, as our department as it stands, do a fair amount of reporting. It looks where it's going is they won't be able to continue to do that. But they don't know where they can go to continue to do that if they want to. So basically, we don't know what we're negotiating. Anyway.
Okay, no, thank you, Hannah. That's great. I mean, it's very difficult to summarise something as complicated as that, but it gives us an indication. Did you want to say something, Paul, at this point?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of this comes down to sort of the consultation period, doesn't it? And what can be achieved during that consultation period. Because I think the problem that the BBC has at the moment is there are various different redundancy programs and job loss programs all running, but not running necessarily at the same time. And it would be useful, I think, if they were in sync, because that would help people understand about where opportunities might be created elsewhere. Like the previous person was speaking about the generation of the hubs. Until we know what the hubs are going to be like and what roles there's going to be in the hubs, people haven't got the full picture. So I think these are the kind of things, and I'm sure we'll come on to talk about this, but these are the kind of things that can be achieved in the consultation period to make sure that, you know, various programs are extended so that people aren't having to make the decisions till they've got all the information.
Thanks very much, Paul. I'm going to move on now, unless anybody wants to add anything else to this, because we've got a fair kind of indication of the kind of complicated nature of the environments that you're all finding yourselves in. But I want to start moving on to some other areas that you can look at now to help you to challenge some of this. Martine, have you unmuted yourself? Would you like to say something?
Yeah, I've got a really peculiar situation where our boss is saying that we've got to lose overall 19 roles, 3 presenters, which is quite a challenge, and 6 production staff. It's an overall closure of 21 posts, but 2 more are going to reopen. So once again, we're finding that we're going to have more managers than we've had before as a proportion of the rest of the staff, and I'd like to know what we can do as a union to push back on that. We are ever more top heavy, but also my boss in one respect has been very positive about being able to meet all of the post closures with VR. So he's not putting everyone formally at risk. That means that we think that we're not able to ask to be put into the redeployment pool. And so you could find that you know, some way down the track in this consultation process, you've not been formally put at risk early enough, and therefore you miss out on redeployment opportunities. And so his reassurance on the one hand is good, but not if it prevents people from being redeployed.
That's a very difficult one, and we'll come back to that point. I don't know whether you want to address it now, Paul.
Well, yeah, I mean, just briefly, so for people who maybe don't know, there's different categories of being at risk, but the one that gives you the best chance of being redeployed is category 1. And then if a job comes up that you are an exact match for, then you can be given the job board unless there are other people that are also exact match. So there are many advantages in terms of being put at risk as early as possible, because that's going to give you a better chance of being redeployed. But of course that does then put you under huge stress because you are at risk, formally at risk, and then the clock is ticking. So it's I mean, to answer Martine's question, it's a difficult one, isn't it? What I can understand exactly what the boss is trying to do, because he isn't wanting to put people under necessary stress. But the quicker you're put at risk, the longer you're on the redeployment database, and the more chance there is of finding another role. So it's, you know, there's not a right or wrong answer on that one, unfortunately.
And I suppose the other thing to consider here is, you know, what do the members want themselves? Maybe this is a discussion that you need to have with your members, and whether it's something that they want to decide on. If they want to be put at risk and then deal with that because they want to have the opportunities for redeployment, then so maybe it's time to do a survey or a trawl of your members to see what they think, and then you can base what you take forward on that. That might be you know, so it's actually being driven by the members. It's what they want, because it is a very difficult situation to be put into.
That's a really good idea, and I hadn't thought of that. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Anybody else? Welcome, Jat. I'm glad you're able to make it. Right, I'm going to share my screen again, and I'm just going to go back to where we were, if I can find it. Hope you can all see this. Okay, so I'm going to flick through this one because this isn't particularly relevant to you, but what is relevant here is about the unfair or discriminatory dismissal that I want to come back to as well, because I want to talk about equality and redundancy here, and I think this is really important. Obviously, equality impact assessments is an important step an employer should take when undertaking redundancy, and it's not just enough to kind of go through a tick box activity. It needs to be done meaningfully, and that means it needs to be done in consultation with the unions. So this is something that you need to be negotiating with, to look at the impact of any particular positions going. Are certain people going to be suffering a detriment over other people, certain groups of workers, etc., etc. it's unlawful for an employer to discriminate against any employee in a redundancy situation. And obviously, under the Equality Act 2010, you've got the protected characteristics, which are really important. And what's really important about this as well, and to bear in mind, is that the discrimination, the issue around equality and discrimination should be addressed and should be looked at every stage of the process, right from the beginning all the way through. So in terms of equality, it shouldn't just be an equality impact assessment is done, tick box, done it, now let's just carry on. Actually, it needs to be looked at throughout the whole process. And this comes back to also some of the issues that Kate and other people talked about, and Sancha, about, well, what's going to happen to the people that are left? So an equality impact assessment should also assess, you know, what's the impact in terms of equality on people that are left as well. That's really important. And of course, we've also, when we look at health and safety, we've also got the COVID-19 situation to take into account as well, which is another additional responsibility that an employer has. So specifically, the employer is also under a duty to make reasonable adjustments to remove any disadvantage faced by disabled employees during the redundancy process. So what amounts to a reasonable adjustment depends on the employee. I just want to pick up on one point, and I'm going to just pick up one thing here. It can be a reasonable adjustment, and this is really important. It can be a reasonable adjustment to prioritise a disabled employee over non-disabled co-workers for suitable vacancies when implementing a redeployment policy. So again, as trade union reps, this is something we need to bear in mind. This is not just about making a reasonable adjustment in terms of supporting an employee, but it can also be about promoting and making sure that an employee who is disabled actually gets priority treatment if necessary in the redundancy process. And there is case law around this. So again, you know, it might be a useful argument. As well as being automatically unfair, it is sex discrimination to select a woman for redundancy for a reason connected with pregnancy, maternity leave, parental leave, or adoption leave. That's something else that's really important. So in terms of suitable job offers, any of these categories don't have to apply for that job. They should be automatically slotted in. And this is one of the few areas of employment law that is very useful. It's unknown, it's hidden, and it's an important one to be aware of, because you may well find that many women who are on maternity leave who are feeling very vulnerable because they're already feeling disconnected from the workplace because of COVID-19 and feeling very isolated, but also more vulnerable because of the redundancy that's taking place as well. So it's really important to make members aware, if they are in this situation, that these are their rights, and to have those conversations with them. And I'll put the last one down as well, because I think it's important to acknowledge it's automatically unfair to select individuals for redundancy because they are or are not trade union members. We know, and there have been a couple of examples where trade union reps have been, the BBC have tried to discipline particularly one trade union rep for raising a health and safety issue around COVID-19 very early on. That was back in March. And it was about a manager not actually knowing what the rights were of this particular health and safety rep, what they're allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do. So it's important we know that what their rights and entitlements are. So clearly the BBC has a policy, and the policy is what you're following and what you should be following. And it's important that you know the policy, because at the moment there's no difference in law around voluntary and compulsory redundancy at all. They are dealt with in exactly the same way. But clearly, if somebody goes on voluntary redundancy, you often get better terms, not in the circumstances that you're in, because your terms will be directly related to your BBC policy. So whoever goes on a voluntary basis will get what's in your BBC policy. But what can be useful, and we've seen a really good example of this at Southampton City Council. They've been able to secure a deal that all voluntary redundancy requests would be accepted for staff who wished to seek alternative opportunities outside the council, regardless of what jobs they did. And then whoever were left were given the jobs that were left. And this was really good, because basically nobody was made to leave. Nobody actually lost their job who didn't want to take voluntary redundancy. So I think that was an important kind of success story to share with you, really. So let's move on then, because I want to look at collective redundancy definition. and I'm sure you're all aware of this. It comes into play. Section 188 is the part of the Act, the Trade Union and Labour Relations Consolidation Act. Comes into play when an employer is proposing to dismiss as redundant 20 or more employees at one establishment within a period of 90 days or less. There might also be contractual changes also sit under section 188 as well, so any contractual changes are exactly the same. It's important for trade unions to ensure that they are absolutely in there in terms of the consultation. So for some of you that have talked about, we don't know what's going on, nobody's given us any clear guidance on what's going on, we don't know what the plan is, it's really important to push back and say we need to know the plans. You cannot expect us, you cannot expect our members to make any decisions about what they should be doing, what they should be applying for, where they should be going, if you're not giving us any clear plans. And this is a really important part of collective redundancy, and I want to bring us on to that point, because it's important to understand what consultation means. Was that somebody wanted to say something?
Me, Hannah, just wanting to ask a question about this, because my mum's been on about collective redundancy, and I was just, so this may be really stupid, but I was just, does it count across the whole BBC, or is it within one department? Because, do you see what I like? Because at the moment, obviously, they're making like maybe 500 people redundant, or they want to, but in our department, it's 11.7. So, which, I don't know, like, is it as it falls across one department or across an entire organisation?
As far as I'm aware, and Paul might want to add to this, is it's across the entire organisation, because the BBC is seen as one establishment, but it might be split depending on budgets. Paul, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, just looking at the BBC policy actually while you were speaking, Hannah, I mean, the BBC often goes a little bit further than what the law says. So it says that the BBC is committed to consult for a minimum of 30 days, where it's proposed to dismiss as redundant between 1 to 99 employees. So in a way that makes the other bit irrelevant, because if they're making just one person redundant, they're prepared to consult for 30 days. That would count as collective redundancy in the BBC policy, I think. Does that answer the question?
It does, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, if you look at the BBC policy, it's under 1.2. And actually the BBC policy is laid out very clearly, whether you like it or not, parts of it, but actually it is much better than the statutory, much better than statutory in many different areas, and that's one of them. But it's in 1.2, so do have a look at that, because these are important things to know. It was a good question, Hannah, thank you. Accompanying members, it's important to talk about what your rights are in terms of accompanying members. Employees and staff reps will still be allowed to accompany colleagues to redundancy meetings, even if they are themselves furloughed. It's not relevant in your situation. But the important thing is under your house agreement, under your recognition agreement. And for those of you that have done any reps training, which are most of you, I think you've done reps training, will know that you have the right to have paid time off to accompany members to meetings. So obviously most of your meetings are going to be done remotely, but nonetheless you are entitled to paid time off as normal, to speak to the member beforehand, to accompany the member to the meeting, and also to do any follow-up as well. And this will include also any time off you need to prepare to and go to meetings with employers around consultations around redundancy as well. But it's an important one to just kind of bear in mind. Let's just quickly talk about redundancy pay. I mean, redundancy pay is all laid out in the BBC agreement, but this is just to kind of to reinforce that really. Only employees dismissed wholly or mainly because of redundancy are entitled to redundancy payment, and your redundancy the payments are all written out in the there's a formula at the bottom on 6.1 in the BBC policy, and there's also a formula for part-time workers as well, which I think is really important, in that it takes average hours when you've been working full-time and part-time, so that it's not just done on your part-time earnings, which I think is really important. Okay.
Maybe just to mention here that there was a change in the law yesterday, or the government's proposing a change in legislation for the redundancy cap to be set at 95,000 for public sector workers, which will include the BBC. And I think we're expecting that to come into force on November the 26th, so I heard. So that could have an impact for some of our better paid members who would be leaving the BBC with more than £95,000, but so they might want to. It might encourage more people to come forward, I think, for voluntary redundancy, because this will be the last chance that members get to leave with more than £95,000. And I think you'd have to have signed the agreement to. You won't actually have to have left the BBC by November the 26th, but you will have to have signed the paperwork if you want to leave the BBC with more than £95,000. So that, as I say, it might encourage some of our better paid members to come forward for VR if they were sort of in two minds about it.
Thanks very much, Paul. So, consultation. The employer's statutory obligation under Section 188 is to consult in good time. And this is about transparency. So this is about you being past the process from the early stages. So about ways of avoiding dismissals, reducing the number of employees to be dismissed, and mitigating the consequences of the dismissals. So meaningful consultation, and that's what we're talking about here. It's about consulting in the spirit in which, you know, the negotiations should take place. It means exploring and responding effectively to all ideas reasonably suggested. Now, I'm a great believer in not just going in and saying you can't do that or you shouldn't be doing that, but actually if we're going to say that an employer shouldn't be doing that, or we don't like what they're doing, well, what do we want them to do? So we should be going in with ideas. So it's important to be proactive in this process if we're going to try and get the best outcomes from our members, not just those that are leaving, but those that are staying. And that's really important. So think about, and some of you are already thinking about some of the problems that you've got, but also think about some of the solutions. So how do you think you could tackle these? You're the experts. You know how to do the work that you're doing. You know what needs to be done in order to be able to make sure that the output contains to be of a high standard, all this kind of thing. So you need to be thinking about what kinds of things you think an employer should be doing to mitigate the effects of any redundancies that are taking place. And an employer has got to be able to demonstrate that they've taken this on board. That's what we're talking about in terms of meaningful consultation. So good time means you need to be in there very early on. And if you're not involved in the discussions now, then it's really important you start pushing back on this and getting in there and saying, actually, we need to have more discussions. We need to be meeting more regularly. We need to have more information. So ask questions, be specific about what information you want to know, put timeframes on it. We need to know by this date so our members can then make some informed choices about what they want to do and what choices they might have. Paul, did you want to?
Yeah, so I was just going to say, and it's also worth pointing out that you are entitled to access to certain information in order to come up with your alternative plans. I think there was a case in Newsnight recently when they asked to see what the freelance budget was so that they could come up with a plan based around, and they were told that was confidential information and it wouldn't be shared. And we challenged that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that information has now been shared. So managers often try to fob you off, or HR people try to fob you off by telling you that you're not entitled to certain information, but you can push back on that.
Can I ask about that?
Mother of Chapel for Newsnight, so you're quite right on that. And thank you for that push on our behalf. But we're in this sort of consultation period with putting forward alternative proposals, which we're doing with fairly regular Zoom meetings and chats when I'm in the office, when I do meet people, and I'm making sure that I do that across the board, both with union members but also those who are not members. And the problem is that, you know, there are various things. For example, one of our alternative proposals was moving to a different studio, which we have done throughout the pandemic sort of period, which is Studio E. It's unmanned, it's cheaper. Now, we're told that we won't be going back to Studio B, which is what came out last week in the Fran announcement. So that, we thought, would be part of a saving that we could take on board to mitigate one of the redundancies. And now we're being told that that won't be a saving for our budget, but a saving to these sort of studios. So it just seems a little bit haphazard. I mean, the proposals that we're putting forward, not all of them have been costed yet. They're still working on it. And again, it's a question of not just people dragging their feet. To be fair, you know, people are working during COVID, organising meetings, and, you know, it's really a fully functioning programme at the minute, 5 days a week. But we really are not sure in this consultation how meaningful they want to make that period by, you know, the whole proposals and giving us the sort of costs that we can sort of make savings and put alternatives. And it's been sort of like teeth, really.
Maria, may I just say, it's Martine here from the news channel. I was aware that there were closing fees for daily programmes, and that will save a huge amount of money because it's a very expensive studio to run. But my understanding is that, and I really would encourage you to challenge this, is that the production operations or TV output costs, as they're now called, as in floor managers, the crew, electricians, camera operators, very much fall on your programme's budget.
Yes.
And so I would certainly be challenging it and saying, hold on a minute, show us where this cost normally sits and why is it now not going to be a saving to us to save some jobs. It's a terrifically expensive studio, and that's why they're closing it for daily programmes. Andrew Marshow's not going back in there. All of the world output is coming out of there. And I know that these costs fall on us because we're going to lose our lighting and vision operator, which is also falls under that sort of studios and tech ops pot, because again, it's a saving to our channel. So I don't believe their arguments to you.
That's very useful, Maxine. Thank you. I mean, we've learned also that we're losing our bespoke archivists who often work with us until the end of the shift. And we do draw a lot on archive. And it has, as we were discussing earlier or mentioned earlier, it does impact you mainly on the producers, because not only are you having to locate the material, but there's a whole issue about copyright in it, because we all know about APTN agreements or not using that. But now we're in a world of digital, of YouTube. It's quite a complex sort of thing to be sort of looking at on an on the day or an on the day plus. And, you know, it has impacted on the work that we do and the schedule. And, you know, I have to say on Newsnight, it is absolutely normal to work through your lunch hour and work through your supper break in order to get the stuff on air. So that's yet another sort of issue that you're having to face and deal with, given the cuts.
And that's a health and safety issue as well, Maria, which I think is really important to acknowledge, because a lot of this, the issues that you're talking about are health and safety issues, and an employer has a duty of care to address those issues, and it's our role to ask them how they're going to address them. So thanks very much, Martin. I think it's really important to push back and be prepared to push back when an employer says no, because we need to be prepared that an employer will always say no initially if we ask for information. The important thing is that we continue to push back on that and say, actually, we are entitled to this. And there are some regulations, which are disclosure of information regulations, which you are entitled to access when you are negotiating. But it is about being specific about the information that you want. So knowing what you want and then also knowing how you can use that information is a really important part of that. So
can I ask, sorry, just test the boundaries of that a little bit? So some of my members have been asking for a very long time. I realise it's not quite as concrete as other things, but there are certain managers where literally the question is, what do they do? And we've had members who have literally asked for, can you give us a timeline of what you do in a week? You know, just sort of a list of tasks that you are responsible for, because we've got some very overlapping roles. It's the kind of thing that feels sort of really rude to keep pushing for, and they, you know, consistently we're just told no. But do we have a right to that kind of information?
You have a right under the disclosure of information regulations, and say if this is not right, Paul, from a BBC perspective, but you have a right to ask for general information. So you could ask for copies of job descriptions. What you can't ask for is individual information that is confidential to that person. But there's no reason as part of your negotiations that you can't ask for copies of job descriptions, so you can start comparing job descriptions and job specs. Paul, did you want to say any more about that?
No, just to agree with you. I mean, there must be a job description for every job in your area. I mean, if the person left tomorrow, there'd have to be a job description in order to fill in behind them. So giving you that information should be fairly easy, and I imagine should even be on file from when the job was advertised. So that should be something that HR should easily be able to give you.
Can I just poke up? Sorry, because we've got sorry to slow everyone down.
Who's this?
We've got a situation.
Sorry, can you say who you are?
Sorry, it's Hannah. Hannah
Hi,
from.
Hannah. Okay.
So in live political programmes, something that's really frustrating our members is the film unit has a leader who is the deputy editor of the live political programmes department, but his job is to lead the film unit. Now the film unit is going, but his job is not under threat. So we're all a bit puzzled as to what he's going to be doing and why he's not at risk, because presumably he's paid enough to, you know, keep on like 2 BJs, but potentially won't be doing anything that anyone can work out. So might that be, I don't know, you guys are experiencing this, we're trying to think of ways to go into negotiations and kind of say, why is this job not being touched when he's now got no defined role? Would asking for a job description be a good way of doing that, do you think? Or are there other ways we could raise that in our LLMs?
And I think asking for the job description. I mean, did you say his title was film manager or something?
Well, his title is deputy. Well, I'm not sure. I think his title is deputy editor, but his role is to be the editor of the film unit, which has now gone. He doesn't deputy edit any of the live output. So, yeah. But
yeah, no, absolutely. I don't see any reason why you can't ask for that. I mean, presumably, I imagine that they will bat it away by saying that he's now going to be taking on some other responsibilities or something. But I think that is definitely the type of information they should bring with you.
Thank you.
Anna, just for your information, it's Maria again. We're similarly looking at the second deputy editor's role on Newsnight as part of our alternative proposals and asking for that post to be closed and some of those responsibilities to be shared out amongst the assets and others. We have a sort of, we have in the past used that structure quite successfully, and given we're doing fewer films, we won't necessarily need a second deputy, and the response has been it's to kind of give the senior managers a break. I mean, I'm not being horrible to them because they do work really hard, but you know, we're trying to save a job and trying to save the journalism on the programme. They're not sort of jobs behind the scenes. So, you know, you do come up against resistance, and they have put forward a few sort of points that the second deputy does, but we've been able to answer those. We've got no conclusive responses yet in terms of whether that post will be closed, but you can do that and you can make those demands.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the key, and this is obvious, is you know, just to be careful, you don't make it personal about the individual. You know, it's not about the individual, it's about the actual role, isn't it? And I think it's about you phrase it in any negotiations to make sure it doesn't become a bit personal.
The issue is if it becomes personal, then they will very easily push back and say, this is confidential, this is nothing to do with you, this is about this particular person. And I think that's why we need to be very careful what information we ask for. So have a look at the disclosure of information regulations. If you have a look at the ACAS website, there's a really good guide on there that will, and I'll show you the ACAS website at the end, that will just tell you what kind of information you can ask for, because it's general information you can ask for, but it is about being specific and knowing what you want, and also putting a timeline on it is really important, because if you just ask for information and don't put a time on it, then it can very easily just drag on and on and on. It just frustrates the whole situation. So it is important to kind of know what you're asking for. So obviously we're talking about collective...
Hiya, Caroline, sorry.
Yeah, Johnny, hello.
Hiya, sorry. And it's maybe a question for Paul, because it's BBC specific, but Paul, just to clarify, with the amount of information that we can ask for. So first of all, in the business economics unit, there is 6.5 post closures. Are we entitled to find out what value that equates to? So what the overall amount is that they are wanting to save with those post closures? Yeah,
I mean, absolutely. I mean, I don't think the law, redundancy law, is absolutely clear on the information you can have and you can't have. But I would think that is quite clearly information you should be allowed to have. Absolutely.
Cool.
Because how on earth can you come up with your own plan if you don't know how much the department's trying to save?
Yeah. And then with that in mind, would it be reasonable, would it be fair, and this is maybe one for you, Caroline, as well, to ask for the department's overall budget, so you could possibly forensically go through, you know, where the outgoings are, where the savings, where we think the savings could go to, because there's been rumours around the business unit for years that there's a lot of overseas properties, you know, in the different business bureaus that the unit's still paying for, but nobody ever uses them. You know, so it's things like that, that if we could say that, you know, we're still paying for these, but they're of no benefit to the business unit, you know, if we could offload them, would that make some sort of savings?
I mean, I don't know whether Paul wants to say something here, but you are perfectly entitled to ask for information, financial information under the disclosure of information regulations. You are entitled to ask for financial information that is a matter of public record, so which it is. So and that doesn't give any confidential information away. So as long as there's nothing confidential in there, that's the key thing. And you know, if you ask for this information, be clear about why you want it. So that's because that's another thing.
Yeah.
Why do you need this information? You can be clear. We need this information because of what, you know, have your evidence there, because when they push back, then you can challenge it again. And obviously there is an external body that oversees the implementation of disclosure of information, which is the Central Arbitration Committee. So the worst case scenario, and I'm not suggesting for a second you should even go down that route, because it is the worst case scenario, because that means then, you know, the discussions that are taking place just become very hostile and very difficult. But there is a body that oversees that. So it might be that you have to actually refer to those regulations at some point in order to be able to just push back a little bit. So if they refuse to give you those information, you could potentially refer to them just to push back a bit. Paul, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, the phrase that the BBC often uses when it doesn't want to give you information is business sensitive.
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah.
But it's hard to see that is really business sensitive. You know, that must be somewhere in the public domain if they own some buildings. So I don't see why they couldn't disclose how much they're spending on those buildings or how much those buildings are worth. I think they would be on dodgy ground to claim that is business sensitive, personally.
Mm. And it's not 100% that these even exist. You know, it's, you know, the BBC's rife with hearsay and rumours. So, you know, but
Thanks,
yes, thank you. Like,
thanks very much, Johnny. And I see that
exercise in forensic accounting.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Johnny. Jat, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to ask just, I don't know if I'm sorry I missed the first half hour, we might have answered it, but I just want to know how much we can push for having representation on the sort of department boards when they decide, you know, where the cuts are and who goes and who doesn't. How much can we ask for a union reps to be on as part of that decision-making process?
Do you want to answer that one, Paul?
Well, I mean, I think the short answer is we don't have any representation. I mean, that's the problem. I mean, obviously we have the LLMs and the DLMs to feed into the process once those decisions have been made, but we're not involved in the decision-making process. And it would be great if we were. And certainly, you know, in some countries, I think in Germany in particular, they do have union representation on the board, and they would be involved in that kind of decision-making process, but we don't have any right to that at all at the BBC. All we can do is come up with our counter proposals, you know, during the consultation period.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so let's move on to individual consultation now, and look at what that means. And I want to start talking about fairness and some of the terms that we've been talking about earlier. So regardless of whether you are involved in collective consultation, the employer also has a duty to consult every individual. So every individual who's at risk has the right to have a consultation, a one-to-one consultation meeting, which is where they would have a right to have somebody to accompany them. So this is where you as a rep would be involved in that. They are entitled to have a certain number of things before that meeting. So first of all, they must have been written to tell them that they're at warning of a risk of redundancy. That's the first thing. And then before the meeting, the employer must provide details of the selection criteria. So they're entitled to see details of the selection criteria. The person's scores, if used, it depends on how the selection criteria has taken place. Explanation of the scoring methods. And also to give the employee a genuine opportunity to challenge the decision. So in order for an employee to actually be able to challenge it, ask questions and all these kinds of things, they need to have this information before the meeting, which means that they can go in and have a meaningful consultation rather than a tick box consultation. Which kind of brings us to what we mean by fair consultation, because we've heard of this word fair, and I think it's important to start unpicking what we mean by fair. And I'm going to start looking at a few key things here, because these are things that we can push back on. Fair consultation must include giving the person being consulted a proper opportunity to fully understand. That means given all the information. So for those of you that have said we actually haven't got enough information to be able to make a decision, well, it's important. And this all comes from the law. So fully understand, you can't do that unless you've got all the information. They're entitled to express views on them. And consideration needs to be given to the views. So there needs to be a demonstration that they're actually taking these views on board. There should be consultation with the individual employee at every stage of the redundancy process once they've been provisionally identified as at risk. So this is a bit further down the line for some of you, but certainly it's something you need to be thinking about here. And again, think about the Equality Act. Think about, are there any concerns here that you need to consider around equality? Are there anything you need to be thinking about? Are reasonable adjustments being made? Is the individual being given the support that they need to have in order to be able to participate fully in the process? So let's look at what we mean by fair and reasonable. And I've pulled out a few things here that I think are really important. Advance warning, so as much warning as possible. So, which means that you're involved in that process as early on as possible as you possibly can be. So I think it was Jack who just asked that question about being on the board. Germany and many other countries, France, they all have workers sitting on the boards when these decisions are being made. And it's something that has come through the EU, it's a European regulation, and it's workers' councils. And it is something that we do see in some companies in this country, certainly companies that have got companies abroad and in other parts of Europe, but it's never been something that's been part of our culture in this country, sadly. So it's important to be there kind of at the start, really. Making sure that individual consultation is meaningful. Selection is set against objective criteria. Now, this is quite a grey area here, and I think, Paul, you might have something to say about this, because it says if possible. Because some of the language that's used sometimes to select jobs that are going can be subjective. And some of the reasons that employers come up with as to why certain jobs should go over others can be subjective. But it's really important to push back on this, because the selection, it does make it quite clear in the law that it should be objective as far as possible. So what you would be saying was, if it isn't objective, well, why isn't it objective? What makes it what means that, what are you doing that means that it can't be objectively selected? Did you want to have anything to say about this, Paul?
Yeah, I mean, this comes down, I suppose, in a way to the selection pool, doesn't it? Is that what we're, and that's, I mean, in the local radio job cuts that are going on at the moment, they've only selected people from band B and band C. So we're arguing that that's not fair, and that, if there's a 25% reduction in the output, which there is in local radio, then every role, in theory, every band should suffer a reduction of 25%, rather than just picking on the B's and C's, which just happen to be the lowest paid members of staff. And obviously, you have to get rid of a lot more B's and C's compared to getting rid of one E or F. So I mean, that's something we certainly have argued about in previous job cuts. I mean, the downside of that is that I always feel a little bit uncomfortable by asking for the pool of people who are at risk to be expanded, because that's then putting more of our members at risk and putting them through the stress of potentially being made redundant. So it's a judgment call, really, on whether you want the pool as big or as small as possible. And I don't think there's a hard and fast rule. You've got to sort of just judge it on what the circumstances are in your particular area.
And I think that also, thanks, Paul, that also comes back to the point that we should be sending it back to our members. We should be asking our members, well, what do you want? Do you want us to challenge this? How do you want us to challenge this? Remember, we're there representing our members' interests, so we need to understand what their views are. So making sure that we communicate with members at every single stage of this, asking members what they want, is really important in helping us to be able to take things forward, and also challenge it in a way that we know our members want us to challenge it. That's really important.
Caroline, can I just add
of course
to something? Just obviously being in local radio, this is something that our members have been most angry about, really, the B's and C's. And I think a lot of their arguments are that the roles that they have are often done by D's as well. So, say, production staff. So, you know, in local radio, you could easily have somebody band D doing the same job as band C, really, when it comes to producing a show. So I think this is why they feel it's particularly unfair. But, you know, I appreciate also we've got members who are band D who, you know, wouldn't particularly want to be in that provisionally at risk pool.
And I think so.
Yeah,
sorry, Paul, carry on.
I was saying, so that is something we're going to be we've got, as you may know, a divisional liaison meeting next Thursday, and that's something we're going to be raising with Helen Thomas. I mean, I think it's important that we don't just pick on, in this particular instance, band Ds. I think it's, you know, we need to be calling on the job cuts to be spread evenly across all of the bands, and then it just doesn't look like we're focusing on band D. I mean, if you've got radio stations now with fewer programs, do you need a managing editor for every single radio station, or could you have one managing editor between two radio stations? That's the kind of thing I think that we'll be maybe urging Helen Thomas to think about.
Thank you.
The other. Sorry, did somebody else want to say something?
Yes, just very briefly, and maybe it is too complicated. What's being proposed for us brings together, of course, two different bits of the BBC, and we have our objections, kind of the mirror image of the objections of the other half, really, which is news gathering correspondence, because they say the new job is their job. Why should they have to apply for it? And we say, this is not our job. Why are you making us apply for it? So, you know, it's kind of challenging because you've got, as I say, contradictory objections to what's being proposed, which are coming from different chapels.
I think this is sorry, Paul, did you want to?
I mean, to be honest, I didn't hear that much of that because you were breaking up a bit. But I mean, that might be something, because it is quite detailed. That might be something that we pick up offline. I think that might be the best thing.
Yeah, that would be great. Thanks, Paul.
Caroline and Paul, just to bring up Newsnight again, having had a legal consultation with one of the people in category 1 at risk, there is a concern about the pool, the lack of a pool selection process and the criteria that we use, and some of which are actually quite incorrect. So we probably will be following that if we can't mitigate some of the redundancies. And, you know, it's important that, because as I've explained to other members, there could be further cuts down the line. We're not at the end of the road, and it's important that there is a sense of transparency and fair practice.
Absolutely, and I think that's really important to push back on, Maria, that transparency and accountability, because it's, you know, it's an employer's responsibility to reach an agreement around this. It's their obligation to reach an agreement, but how you reach that agreement and that process, it's really important to set the rules, if you like, or help set the rules and agree the rules as we're going along, and challenge them and keep pushing back if they're not being transparent and open about why they're making certain decisions. I think the volunteers released first I put down here as fair and reasonable, because I think, I mean, I like the Southampton example where the unions have actually agreed that anybody who wants to go, regardless of the job that they're doing, can go first, and then they will look at what's left. Is good for members who don't want to lose their job, who don't want to be made redundant, who don't want to have to go and find work at this time. So that might be something that some of you want to think about as well. Again, I come back to equality impact and risk assessments as well, as being a really important part of the whole process. Apologies, I'm just looking at people who are raising their hands. Fran first, would you like to go, and then I'll ask Jat to come in.
Hello, sorry if this is an ignorant question. When you said volunteers released first, is that volunteers for voluntary redundancy?
Yes, it is, Fran, yeah.
So that's kind of the crux of the two we are also in the department where Sanchi is talking about reporters' cuts, which I think are far more complicated. But there's two roles, particularly within WOTO and PM, where we've essentially been assured by managers that they think that this will be managed by VR. And perhaps we wouldn't have too much of a problem with that if that all goes ahead as planned, but they're giving absolutely no idea of timetable. What can we push for in terms of that and timetable? They say that they can't decide anything until HR decide anything. Yeah.
Thanks, Fran. Paul, did you want to answer that, or do you want me to come back on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, again, I don't think it's necessarily a black and white answer, because it's going to depend on the circumstances. I mean, we as a union, we try not to stand in the way of people that want to take voluntary redundancy and you know, let them go as soon as possible. But obviously, you've got to have one eye on what that's going to mean for the amount of work once they've gone. You know, if they're not stopping the work, arguably we can't be releasing volunteers. So it depends on those kind of factors. But as a rule, we try not to delay people that want to take voluntary redundancy.
May I come in on that point?
Who's that?
It's Kate from Radio News.
Yeah, yeah, I have got other people.
Kate Perrin from Radio News. Can I just
quickly, because I have got other people who've got their hands up.
It was only that relevant point. It's just that they appear to, or it's just that our department seems massacred because we've got so many voluntary redundancies. They're basically going, oh, you've got loads of voluntary redundancies, so therefore let's just cut your department.
Yeah, I mean, just quickly before we move on to the other questions, I mean, basically in BBC News, there are more volunteers than there are job cuts needed, which is obviously a positive. But I think we do just have to manage how we let people go, because, as I say, there's no point letting people go if the work's still there. It has to be done, you know, hand in hand.
And also, Kate, I think the other issue.
Caroline might have frozen. Maybe I'm the.
Sorry, I think the internet is really struggling this afternoon.
We can hear you now.
Okay, right. Sorry about that. What was I going to? What? I think the other issue here is that this is a health and safety and welfare issue, and actually part of the process of redundancy, any redundancy that is often overlooked, is that a risk assessment should take place on, well, what's going to happen for to the people who are left behind, and that needs to be part of the discussion, Kate, particularly in the situation you might find yourselves in that department. How is the work going to be divvied up safely? How are people going to continue to work safely and in a healthy way? And you need to be part of that process, and it might be that you need to be proactive about how you have that discussion, because most employers don't have that discussion. They don't even think about it until after the process is gone, and then when everybody's left, they then think about, well, how are we going to divvy this work up between people? And I've seen it done appallingly in the past, where things are just divvied up between people and people end up getting an extra job on top of their own job, or an extra job and a half sometimes. Sit all the time. Pia, would you like to, you've got your hand up, would you like to come in? I think Pia's disappeared. Okay. Pia, did you want to come in?
Sorry. Yes, I did. Thank you. I just wanted to say that's going to be really, really useful for us to ask for a risk assessment beforehand. And surely we can't get a risk assessment done until they tell us what they think the end game is going to be. So we know this is only the first round of redundancies. When are we going to get the second? And my other question is about process. I've been invited to an LLM, my first one. Should I be sending them questions beforehand so that they can come to the meeting prepared? Will there only be one LLM? That sort of thing. Thank you.
Thanks, Pia. Paul, you might want to answer that one.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it depends on the type of question. I mean, if it's information that they're going to have to go away and research, you know, maybe they need to find out how much they're spending on the freelance budget or something, it's probably worth sending it to them in advance. But if it's a question that you think they'll be able to answer off the top of their heads, then I probably wouldn't give them any advance warning, just to see them squirm or get flustered. And then there's no reason why there should just be one local liaison meeting. I mean, it's consultation, so that you can't just have one meeting that counts as consultation. It will depend on the progress you're making, and you might agree everything at the first local liaison meeting, that you won't need another one, or it might throw out more questions and answers, and you'll want one a week for the next few weeks until you feel that you've exhausted the consultation process. So it will depend on on the level of questions that it throws up, and whether you get the answers that you're happy with. Just to add one more thing about risk assessments and that kind of thing. What we have done in some areas is carry out a stress survey before any cuts have happened, and then carry out another stress survey once the cuts have happened and bedded down, and then you can see whether people are feeling more stressed now that the redundancies have taken place compared to beforehand. Because the management will always say, we're going to stop doing things, so don't worry, none of you will have more work to do, none of you will have more stress. But of course, in reality, we know that isn't true. So if you carry out a stress survey beforehand and then afterwards.
With the stress survey, would it be a union stress survey or a management?
There's a health and safety stress survey that you can get online, which is pretty good. It's about 30 odd questions, and some of those can be slightly tailored to to suit your particular area. And if you can get management on board, that's good, because then they can send it to all the workers. Whereas if we are initiating it, we can obviously only send it to NUJ members or union members if we do it in conjunction with BEC2. So ideally, it would be good that if management get on board, as long as they're not going to be doctoring it or anything, or you can trust them. But it is something. If you've got high union membership, then it's something we can just do ourselves.
The other point on the survey as well is that the union can help you to set up a survey if it isn't a joint one, or even if it is a joint one, the union can set it up. And we have an account on SurveyMonkey, so we can very easily set it up for you. So if you were thinking about doing that, if you go onto the Health and Safety Executive website, which is the hse.org.uk, which I put in chat. Oh, it should say hse.org.uk. Sorry, I don't type very quickly and well. So you can go on there, you can lift, it's called an MOT stress MOT. You can lift it, and as Paula said, you can customize it, send the questions to us, we can sort that out for you, and then we can set the survey up for you. Thank you very much to who has given us Jat, thank you very much for that that German model. Yes, it is, and I think it's going to become even more difficult to push for now that we're coming out of the rest of Europe, and it's going to make it even more difficult for us to get onto boards of workplaces. Even though this government has suggested that it would be a good thing, they haven't suggested that they're going to do anything about it, rather than just support businesses doing it and just encourage businesses to do it. I can't really see it happening myself, but. Okay, let's talk about bumping then, because I think it's important to talk about this, and Paul, you might have something to say about this as well. Some of you will have heard of bumping, some of you might not have heard of bumping before, but it is an important part of redundancy, and can be used by employees or employers. An employee whose role is made redundant is offered someone else's role, resulting in that person's dismissal. So the person, they've been offered another role, they get that role, and the other person is then in a redundancy situation. So failing to consider bumping can itself sometimes make a redundancy unfair, and some employers will use it. So Paul, did you want to say anything about this in terms of a BBC context on bumping?
Yeah, so the BBC has had bumping for a long time, and there's probably been some mixed success. So if you've got someone that wants to leave but isn't at risk from redundancy, and they can be paired up with someone that doesn't want to leave but is at risk from redundancy, they can basically swap. One person can be bumped into another person's role. I think that the problem that there's been in the past is that the managers have been able to veto it, and often they've often felt that people who are at risk from redundancy have often been seen, I think, as damaged goods, and managers haven't wanted them because they've kind of had this attitude that, why are they being made? If they were any good, they wouldn't be at risk from redundancy, which of course we know is a nonsense, and anyone can end up being put at redundancy. I think that's less of a problem now, there being that there are so many people being put at redundancy. But what happens is there's a list of criteria, and if the person at risk from redundancy meets that, matches that 5 items of criteria, then they can do this bumping swap. So the BBC are really intent on making it work this time. They're setting up working groups what the unions are going to be sat on, and we're going to have oversight of it. We're going to be able to decide whether the criteria that the managers come up with is acceptable or not, because in the past, managers have done anything they can to stop having someone forced on them. So they've come up with criteria for the person who wants to leave that is just not reasonable. No one could ever match that criteria. But this time, I think the BBC have accepted that there have been problems in the past, so they've got this whole process now to deal with bumping, which is going to be up and running in a few weeks' time. So we're very hopeful that the bumping process is going to work this time. And as I say, in BBC News in particular, there are more volunteers than are needed to deal with the number of job cuts. So that should, in theory, as long as they're in the right places, lead to no compulsory redundancies being needed.
Can I ask something there, Caroline? Sorry.
And Johnny, yeah.
Thank you. That all sounds very, it sounds good, but with that in mind, and historically, when people haven't been accepted into the roles that they've been bumped into, this time round, with the 5 criteria, it sounds as if we don't know what those 5 criteria are yet. But will there be any level of aftercare for the people that are bumped to make sure that they're not sort of harassed or bullied or anything like that? Not to say that would happen, but there's a possibility that could, if again the managers are forced to take the people that are being bumped. You could understand how that could happen.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, that is a good question. And so basically anyone that is bumped will do it on a trial basis, normally a month. It could be up to 3 months. So that's good for both parties in a way, because the individual might decide they've made a horrendous mistake and doesn't want to work in this department. So redundancy would still be on offer to them if they got to the end of that trial period and things hadn't worked out. But that it's monitored. There's meant to be regular updates for the person in the new role. So it's closely monitored. So it shouldn't lead to any more bullying than can happen in any workplace. So yeah, but that has been thought about. That is going to come back to the working party at the end of the month to make sure that the manager hasn't maybe deliberately come up with a reason that this person isn't suitable or claim that they're not performing adequately when they have been. That will be carefully monitored so that they can't sort of make up bogus reasons not to accept that person.
Super, thank you.
Thank you very much. Anybody else got any questions before we move on to, we're just moving on to the last part now, which is kind of just looking at best practice, giving you some ideas.
Hi, Hannah from Millbank. Can I just ask Paul very quickly about, I think we're quite keen in our negotiations to make as much use of that as possible, because obviously our cuts sort of run quite deep. So is there a way to kind of keep in touch with you to see where you're up to on that? Because again, I think timelines are a bit tricky because of when we've, but is there someone we can keep in touch with in the union for how that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, Adam Bowen, have you come across Adam? I think he works in your team, doesn't he?
Okay, fine. So he's across that process.
Yeah, he is. I mean, I've got it took 45 minutes for the BBC to explain the process to us. It's very complicated. I've sat through it twice now. I'm still not 100% sure I understand it. It's a typical BBC process that's got so many elements to it. But it's not ready to launch yet. But I'm sure Adam will be able to give you a heads up when it is.
Yeah, that's fine. He's in our LLMs with us, so
okay.
Oh, that's fine then. Cool.
And we may well be running another one of these type of things kind of at the end of August, beginning of September time as well, when things are moved on a little bit more to look at what happens next. So we will come back to this at a later date, because we realise that people need to be kept informed and you need to be kept in contact with. So we will be organising something again like this. So please do keep in touch with what's having a look on training on the NUJ website, because I'm being asked all the time to do these, because it is important that you keep informed. Okay, let's move on to some areas to negotiate on. This is from an ACAS guide, and I think there's some really useful things in here in terms of just things that you need to bear in mind really when you're going through the process. So keeping trade unions, and remember this comes from ACAS. For those of you that are not familiar with ACAS, ACAS provide codes of practice for employers and workers on best practice, so how different bits of employment legislation should be implemented. And I think these are really good, these areas to look at. So it's something that you can refer to if you feel that an employer is being particularly obstructive, or they're not doing what you feel they should be doing in terms of the spirit in which the negotiations should take place. And these are kind of what we mean by the spirit of good negotiation. So it's a commitment to keep local trade unions and employee reps informed as fully as possible. So right from the word go, this goes back to meaningful, knowing how long the consultation is to last. These are some of the questions that you could be asking. How long is it going to last? Who's to be consulted? What must be discussed? How consultation should be conducted, focusing on the spirit of the consultation. And that's about with a view to reaching agreement. And remember, it's an obligation on the employer to reach the agreement. So they've got to make sure that there is a process in place that reaches agreement. And when we're talking about agreement, we mean that all parties agree. So all parties feel that the end result is something that they could live with. Also think about what statutory information must be provided. This comes back to the disclosure of information regulations. So what information do they hold? If they hold information, and they've got to hold information, general information, then we are entitled to be able to see it. So of course, if you don't know what information they are supposed to hold, then you don't know what information to ask for. So again, this is an area that you need to work on really, and to think about what kind of information you need. Additional areas on which to consult include the effect on earnings, so where transfer or downgrading is accepted as an alternative to redundancy. Arrangements for travel, removal and related expenses where a new role is on a different site, that might be possible. Arrangements for reasonable time off with pay to look for jobs or arrange training. So again, this is kind of further on down the line. Help with job hunting, arrangements to transfer apprenticeships. Won't be applicable, but it might be that you've got people on attachments, for example. Measures to avoid redundancy include natural wastage, so people who are leaving or jobs that have kind of come to a halt because a particular way of working is finished. Restricting recruitment of permanent staff. What are the recruitment and retention? What's the policy at the moment? Has it been put on hold? You know, are they still recruiting in certain areas and they haven't actually restricted that? Reducing the use of agency workers, so any atypical workers, and this is really problematic because obviously a lot of freelance workers who work at the BBC are NUJ members as well, and obviously are already losing out because of changes that have taken place over the last 2 or 3 years. And it's a point that Paul made, you know, how many freelance workers do you actually employ? Filling vacancies internally, cutting overtime. So, I mean, I think this is an area that we should be asking more about, you know, who's doing overtime, who are doing extra hours? Because remember, extra hours can lead to, well, actually, this could be another post. So if people are doing regular overtime over a period of time, well, then we could argue that actually means there should be another post there. Obviously, other avoidance short-time working. So we've seen in many workplaces, we've seen people actually going down to only working 80% of their time or 60% of their time to keep the organisation going over a period of time. Training, retraining and redeployment. This is really important. If people are going to be bumped, are taking on new roles, what's going to be put into place to support them doing that? The point that Johnny made around aftercare, I think that's also in aftercare, is making sure that they get the correct support and the correct training that they need, particularly if they're taking on slightly different role or they're required to use a different digital platform or something like that. Then, you know, what's been put in place to support them, because what we don't want are people who are taking on roles and not being given the support. Sorry, Paul.
I was just going to say about retraining. The BBC does offer what's called the retraining fund, which means you can go off, if you're at risk from redundancy, go off for a month and work somewhere else, which may give you a better chance of getting redeployed. It has to be somewhere where there's a realistic chance of there being a job. So you can't just go and have a jolly for a month on, you know, EastEnders or whatever. It has to be in an area that's might potentially need you at the end of that month, but that's paid for out of a retraining fund budget, so they get you for nothing. The department gets you for nothing, so they're, you know, almost certainly going to say yes if you want to go there, but you have to apply for that, and the details of how to do that are all on Gateway.
If you can find it.
Yeah, you'll find it once, you'll just never find it again on Gateway.
Thanks, Paul. Pia, did you want to say something?
No, he's just answered it. Thank you.
All right. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Other possibilities are about finding savings elsewhere in the organisation, and this is where actually being able to understand financial records can be really useful. So where is money? I think Johnny, the point that Johnny made was really important about where money is being spent on other things. Well, could they save money by not spending on those other things? How much money is spent on expenses, for example? You know, how many people have got are getting benefits in kind? All this kind of stuff could be money that we could, you know, we could start challenging. Well, is this a legitimate expense because we save money here? Reorganising work, cutting executive pay and benefits. I think we've already talked about this. If they're talking about saying, well, we need a 25% saving in this particular area, this particular station, then it should be across the board, not just in just selecting a couple of bands. Temporary flexible working arrangements, sabbaticals can be something else, secondments and unpaid leave. So it's about looking at alternatives, being proactive, coming up with some ideas that can lead to some really meaningful discussions. And of course, quality impact of redundancies should be embedded at every stage of the consultation. This is really important because we know, certainly in certain sectors of society at the moment, we're seeing that women are kind of suffering the fallout from job losses, and they, particularly women who are either pregnant or on maternity leave. We're hearing a lot of cases where women are being selected for redundancy unfairly simply because they've been furloughed or they're on maternity leave. So it is something that we need to be very mindful of, that this doesn't happen either consciously or unconsciously. We need to be very conscious of that. So we've kind of come to the end of the formal stuff now. So the PowerPoint is finished, and I want to stop sharing here and just introduce you to some places to go for some resources, because a lot of the questions that you have got and a lot of the questions that your members will have can be answered by looking at a few of these places. And I should say that the NUJ website, this recording will go up afterwards. So it'll go up on the NUJ website, but it'll also go up with a frequently asked questions fact sheet that I've put together. And I think I mentioned it at the beginning. And that hopefully will address a lot of questions that you may well have. Obviously, some of your questions are going to be BBC specific, so there will be, you'll need to follow up on some of those. Of course, you'll need to follow up on some of those, but hopefully, if you can point your members to some of these resources, it might help you to be able to allay and address some of your members' concerns as well. Because obviously, the more your members know about the process, the easier it's going to be for you to be able to have those conversations with your members, because if they can understand a little bit more about it, then they can ask questions. You can ask questions of them, so you can start having those kind of collective conversations. So I just want to introduce you to 3 places that you can go. Those of you that know me know that, oh, sorry, it didn't share. Those of you that know me will know that I'm always banging on about the Labour Research Department, and there really is good reason for banging on about them, because they really do produce some fantastic information, and they're written from a rep's perspective, and you can access them online for free. And I'll put the password in the chat for you when we stop sharing. If you go online, if you just put NUJ in here, WZP 463, I think it is, WZP 463. You can access all the information online. So all their booklets, the Law at Work Book 2020 has just come out. It's fantastic, and it's COVID-19 been updated. So it gives you all the new regulations, any new changes, all this kind of stuff. It's really good. But the one that you will want to look at, if I can find it, is the one on redundancy. So just put redundancy in there and you will get the one on redundancy. It looks like this, it's yellow, and it's a really, really good publication. I would recommend that you all go online, have a look at this and download it. So this is a really good place to go. They also do lots of other leaflets. So if you're a safety rep, they do lots of fact services and workplace reports. And they do a lot of stuff on the law here. So those of you that are interested in that detail, which I really like, particularly around health and safety, all the information is there. So do have a look at that. Redundancy, the TUC has a guide on redundancy, another really good place to visit. And ACAS, they have some really really important information around redundancy, and in particular they give guidance on how managers should deal with redundancy. And we need to know what managers are being told, so we need to know how we can challenge them. This is what they should be doing. Why aren't they doing it? Well, this is what the ACAS Code of Practice says. So even though the ACAS Codes of Practice aren't legally binding documents, so they're not legal documents in themselves, they are used in employment tribunals when developing case law. So they are useful in terms of creating a benchmark. So I'll put the login details down here. And this is the login detail. Because the NUJ is affiliated to the Labour Research Department, you get free access to all that information. That's why you've got that password there. So please do use it. It's really important that you do use it. So we're kind of at the end now, and this is your opportunity if you want to ask any questions before we finish. So is there anything that anybody would like to ask, would like to comment on, or like to share? Martine, please do.
Hello. I am puzzled and concerned by the way my boss is going about this redundancy so-called consultation. We had an LLM last week, and we're not due to have another one about the cuts for 5 weeks, which to me, I know it's the summer holidays and everything, but it feels far too far away. We're not having any until the end of August, I think it is, according to my diary anyway, and then some more in September. And it's almost, he's a real control freak. I get that. He's an arch procrastinator, but we get there in the end. He's a very nice man and he means well, but it feels like we're being infantilized. And it's like, leave it with me, I can save everything, I can save. And even if he can get everyone out of the door on VR, that nobody's made compulsory redundant, and we only face the cuts that he's talking about, I still want to have to be consulted. I still want to have my opportunity to say, we don't need to lose 19 people. We could do it differently. How do I get him to meet us sooner than that? And I kind of think, I understand his point. What's the point when he hasn't actually presented to us what our output is going to be, how the news channel is going to be joint with the world for more hours of the day than it was pre-COVID? And he can't actually tell us yet any of those things, or what shifts are going to look like, because some people might choose to leave thinking, God, I don't want to stay if that's what it's going to be like. We might actually have more volunteers to go. And then it will be a selection for retention exercise potentially. How do I compel him to crack on and not leave us hanging for 5 weeks?
I think by Caroline's silence, she's leaving that one for me.
She's muted herself. She's muted herself.
I am happy to come in.
So, I mean, I think that is part of the problem. I'll say something, and Caroline can offer some words of wisdom. I mean, I think it is difficult at the moment because a lot of the plans are they feel half-baked, and we haven't got the whole picture, and so it's impossible to actually come up with a definitive plan when we don't have the bigger picture. I mean, presumably your LLM feeds into a DLM, so I mean, maybe you need to be telling your boss that you're going to escalate it to the DLM if he doesn't sit down with you sooner and start to share his vision with you.
Okay.
I think that's probably the best thing to suggest, really.
Yeah, it just feels like we're being just told to sit and wait, and he'll sort it all out, which maybe he will, but there's more than one way to skin a cat, and I don't necessarily like how he's going to do it. And it's not, what are we here for if we're not to be consulted? Is my
and as you say, the plans aren't just about redundancies. The plans are also about what's going to happen to the people who are left behind. And
Definitely.
and all credit to him if he can come up with a plan that makes no compulsory redundancies. That's great, but that's half the job done, isn't it? And then there's what's going to happen to the rest of you who are left behind. So I suppose that's what you need to be pushing him to share with you.
Yeah, and I don't think, to be fair to him, he can at the moment. So I said to him, I don't believe that you should have started the clock ticking on our consultation until you've actually got a plan to bring us. We cannot consult at the moment. There is nothing to consult on.
Yeah, look, I'm hearing that a lot. I mean, I'm quite heavily involved in the English regions cuts at the moment, and that's what we're going to be insisting at the DLM on Thursday, that the consultation period is extended, because we've only got we were given some plans today, even though the clock started ticking 2 or 3 weeks ago. So I think that's something that, from what I'm hearing, a lot of the departments should be pushing back on the timetable, especially, one, it's the summer holiday season, 2, we don't have all the details, 3, we're working from home, which makes it far more difficult to consult than it would normally. So I think we should be trying to extend the consultation period to the end of September, so that gives us a month once people are sort of back at work after their summer holidays.
Thank you. I have one other point I wanted to make, and I know Sancha's heard me say this already, is that if we can, because there isn't a dovetailing at the moment, if they've announced these cuts and we know new jobs are going to be created with the creation of these commissioning hubs, we need the two things to dovetail, so that people aren't out of the building before these new jobs are created. Now, I learned from Pierre Vickery a long time ago that nothing's agreed till everything is agreed can be a really good way of holding their feet to the fire. Slightly difficult this time because we've got this November the 26th potential cliff edge for people who want to go with the £150,000 redundancy cap still in place. However, if we can hold our nerve a bit, my hope is that am I allowed, Paul and Caroline, in my department of 75 people alongside JAT in World, because we're consulting sort of in parallel, there's about 200 people there, and we've got to lose 10% of the posts. Can we say, okay, in principle, we agree to these cuts, these savings, these changes, but we're not signing off until our colleagues in sequence programs and at Millbank, the political colleagues who are waiting for these hubs to open up so we get an idea of where they could be redeployed. Can we do that? Department, can we say yes in principle but not till everyone's safe?
I don't see why not, especially if there's this massive overlap that's going to have a major bearing on who wants to stay and potential redeployment opportunities. Absolutely. I mean, our sort of nuclear option, obviously, is always to say we'll take industrial action if you're going to push ahead with your current timetable. I mean, clearly, we don't want to be resorting to that unless we really have to. I mean, normally, we wait till we've got people at risk of compulsory redundancies and a month away from being forced out the door. But if the timetable if we're not in control of the timetable, or not happy with the timetable, then ultimately that's what we can threaten, or we can put something into dispute, which will slow things down. So there are various weapons in the armory that we can use if they won't agree to that.
I think that, I mean, Sancha and I have already talked about this at another reps meeting that Adam and Leslie held. You were on it, I think, Paul, as well, weren't you? And
I was on it for a bit. I had to go.
Yeah, and then I don't think Hannah was on it though. So this is something that other departments all this technology is so helpful for organising, isn't it? It's so exciting. We absolutely need to be talking to each other across our normal silos and making sure that we're aware of what's happening in each other's departments, because I think my department is probably Jat and I, we're probably going to be okay. But that's not to say we pull up the drawbridge and go, well, we're sorted, let's crack on, when we've got other colleagues at risk.
And I think, just briefly, I think that's where Adam and Leslie come in, because they are obviously the secondees that should be across all of your departments. So if you can feed into them what your master plans are, then they can help bring it all together, NJC or DLMs or whatever. So I think it's important that you keep both Adam and Leslie in the loop about what you're planning and what you're doing.
Paul, it's Maria from Newsnight. I completely agree with Maxine, because although we're in a different department in current affairs, we face the same problems in that the hubs are not up and running. We don't know if people can and would like to move into those hubs, for example, if there's a specialist investigation team. And it's a very kind of mixed sort of timetable. In fact, we're a bit at sea in terms of where we are in the consultation sort of timeline. And it's, again, I think it would be easier if, as a collective, as BBC reps, we could agree that it kicks in again in September or something, so we know what we're heading towards. Because, you know, it is having a big impact on people's welfare. They're kind of worried about taking holiday. They need holiday. They need some rest from sort of COVID. And also the other big point I wanted to make is, how far are people taking on board that if we're going to go it possibly and likely go into a second wave and we're losing people, you know, our team will be really stretched. It's stretched as it is. So to lose sort of people before that is going to make a big impact on the programme.
Yeah, just on the question of the hubs, I think I promised one of these meetings, or a meeting that some of you were at, that I would write to John. Is it John Zika, who's in charge of the hubs, and find out what the timetable was, which I did after that last meeting, and I haven't even had a response from him on that. So I will go back to him and chase him, because it seems like the timetable of the hubs and the jobs that might create are quite key to a lot of the different programs going on in your respective departments.
Can I just say, should I have had an LLM by now, given that the announcement was last week? We all had a briefing from Richard and Jonathan Monroe, who are not our managers, but you know, we haven't actually been invited into the process. Should I contact them and contact HR and say, let's kick this off now?
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I just about heard that. I think, Andrew, if you haven't had one, or you haven't even got one in the diary, then yeah, I would definitely put some pressure on HR to schedule one.
Lovely, thank you.
And with that in mind, Paul, sorry, I got an invite yesterday to an LLM, but it was only the person standing in as deputy editor, Philippa Busby and Sue Banks. Now, neither Adam or Leslie in their roles as secondees were invited. It's important to point that out, that one of them two need to be also in the LLM, isn't that right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It comes back to what I was saying earlier about there's so many different things going on that you can't be across all the plans in other departments, but Adam and Leslie can. So it's important that they are going to all the LLMs that you're having, so they are across the bigger picture, absolutely. And if they're not available, then I would insist that it's rearranged. I think both of them are going to be off on leave next month. So yeah, so make sure that they are both available before you agree to a date.
Yeah, to be fair to the deputy manager, she's in over her head, I think. So, and I think it was an oversight rather than a deliberate thing, because she agreed straight away when I said that I couldn't make it, because Adam and Leslie couldn't.
And it's worth bearing in mind that the deadline to actually have the people out the door, as it were, is the end of March. So we've still got plenty of time, even if we insist on the consultation being extended to the end of September, mid-October. That still really gives enough time for the selection exercises and the 4 months notice, etc. So you know, we shouldn't let the BBC try and railroad us into their own timetable. Because I think the BBC's desire is to get everything done by the first week of January. You know, they've been slightly vague with the timetable. They've said Q1, which obviously means any time between January the 1st and March the 31st. I think in their heads, Q1 means January the 1st. In our heads, it means March the 31st. So we need to make sure that we stick to the timetable that we're happy with, not theirs.
Can I just reiterate that? Because I just wanted to say that having been part of a redundancy process personally myself twice and loads of times with other people, one of the things that one of the dangers is that they try and rush it, and it can be a real danger that the process is rushed, and we need to get this done or we need to get that done, so things get overlooked. Equality impact assessments are almost the first things that go. They're not done properly. A general kind of equality impact assessment is just thrown out. It's absolutely meaningless. It's really important to push back on the detail. So having the time to do that, getting the information, asking the right questions is really important. To slow the process down so that your members have time, you have time to consult properly, you have time to go back to your members, they have time to come back to you. So it is, you know, we're kind of reining it in a bit, if you like, but also saying, actually, the point that Martine's made, we've got an equal right to be here. We've got a right to be here. We've got a right to be consulted meaningfully, and we have a right to do this in a way that we want to see it done properly. And that's why we need to understand what we mean by meaningful, and have all the questions and have our template, if you like, of how we want to see this process being taken forward. Does anybody else want to add anything?
Hi, it's Jack.
Jack.
Jack here. A quick question. So Paul's mentioned that majority of the people will be out the door by 31st of March. There was something about in exceptional circumstances, it'll stretch till the end of December 2021. What are those exceptional circumstances that extend it to the 18-month period?
I've got no idea, to be honest. I'm not sure I actually heard that. I thought all the proposed cuts that we've heard about so far, I thought the deadline was March the 31st. I know in terms of the VR rule, the VR rule is allowing people to put down their own date, isn't it, within reason. So I guess it's possible that if they didn't have enough volunteers to go by March the 31st of 2021, but they did have a lot of people wanting to go at the end of December 2021, they would probably allow that to happen rather than make people compulsory redundant. I assume that's what it means, but I'm not 100% sure.
So would that mean then that it within that target number that they're banding about, that would all be counted within that 18-month period? So that 500 plus could potentially be until the end of December 2021.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that would be the BBC's preferred option, but I suppose if the alternative was compulsory redundancies and the potential of industrial action, then I'm sure that they would, if we were not talking about hundreds, if we're talking about dozens, then there is the possibility, I think, that they would be flexible on that.
Okay, thanks.
And I suppose it's worth just mentioning, but just before we wrap up, that the NUJ's policy is that there should be no compulsory redundancies. So, if we get to a stage where people are facing compulsory redundancies and they're NUJ members, then we would ballot for industrial action, which is why, going back over the last decade that I've been sort of involved in the NUJ, we haven't had any compulsory redundancies. Now, it's going to be easier to avoid them in some places rather than others. So we know that there's more volunteers in news at the moment than there are job cuts, but we know that in English regions there's only 230 volunteers and 450 job cuts. So in English regions it's clearly going to be extremely difficult to avoid compulsories, but we will ballot for industrial action if that's looking like it will happen.
And is there a limit on that, Paul? Would you, if there's only one compulsory redundancy, would it still across the organisation, would you ballot for it?
I think we threatened to ballot over 2 before, and mysteriously they were found jobs by the end of that week. It's amazing. You do find that suddenly the BBC finds roles for people as any deadline looms. I mean, obviously there are exceptions. If people are not accepting alternative employment, if people are turning jobs down and being really fussy, then clearly we're not going to take 2,000 people out on strike on occasions like that. But if people are engaging in the process and they haven't been found alternative employment, then we will ballot for industrial action.
Fantastic. Great.
The key to that, of course, is that if you don't do that, if you don't actually stand your ground at that point, if there are further redundancies down the line and you haven't stood your ground at that point, then it sets a very bad precedent. So you've kind of got to stick to what you say. Otherwise, it just gives a green light to the employers to be able to behave however they want in the future. Okay. Yeah. We're coming to the end now, so unless anybody's got any final points or comments, I'm going to suggest we wrap up because we've just about done 2 hours. I hope everybody's found this useful. Thank you very much, Paul, for coming and co-hosting this redundancy workshop. I hope it's answered a number of questions for you and also given you some ideas as to the kinds of things that you can be thinking about doing. Develop your position, improve your position, get more information about the situation, get more involved, get more engaged, all those kinds of things. So as I say, we will be looking to run another one of these at the back end of August, probably beginning of September time, when we have a bit more information so we can talk through the next part of the process. But in the meantime, if anybody has any ideas about other courses they want developing by the NUJ, you've all got my email. Please do email me because we're looking to build the programme all the time. So please do come back and just give me any suggestions. So thank you very much for taking part. Really good to see you all. And as I say, this is going to be recorded, so it will be up on the website probably tomorrow. Just let your members know that it's up there, get them to watch it because there's lots of information that's been covered today. And thank you very much. You can unmute yourselves now and say goodbye if you like. It's always good to hear your voices.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Paul.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.